Right. Morning, Hudson.
Okay, so we're in chapter 3 of the book of James, and I always suggest to anyone who may hear the video and are cutting in for the first time in chapter 3, glad to have you, but you really should start this book in the first chapter. It really builds. And James chapter 3 is building on something he said in chapter 1 that's important for us. And we're going to see a bit of that of how he's building that out. But I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and I do have a link in the Dropbox. I hope you see it in the chat for the PDF of what I'm going to share. But here it is. And we got into this speech thing last time, but as I was just mentioning, it really starts in chapter 1 when he said everybody should be quick to listen, that is, quick to listen to God's word. We've covered that unit of material that went through the end of chapter 2. And then slow to speak, which really begins in chapter 3 with him saying, not everybody should be a teacher. They're going to face a stricter judgment. And then he gets into this issue of speech, and that's where we're at now. It's basically chapter 3 is the speech chapter, although James mentions speech in every chapter of his epistle. It's clearly something that was important to him. Material we covered last time, but just to put it in a picture, James talks about our speech through the tongue. Now, that's using one thing to sort of symbolize the other. He's using reference to the tongue, but he's talking about the words. And the tongue, unlike our arms and legs, is actually capable of doing more damage. And he talks about how if you could control your tongue, you can essentially control your whole person, your whole body, your whole life. And he gives these beautiful illustrations that are just it's simple to grasp them. The tongue is like a bit in the mouth of a horse, he says. If you pull the bit left or right, that's where the horse goes. And it's the same thing with our whole body. Uh, it's directed by our tongue. The tongue reveals what's in our hearts. And there's no such thing as a mature Christian that has no control over their speech. But people can deceive themselves thinking that the area of speech is sort of, you can do whatever you want there as long as you don't stab people in the back or whatever. But that's not true. It all goes together. And in James 3:4, he likens the tongue to a rudder on a ship. And I had showed this picture before, but rudders are way out of proportion to the size of the ship, even on a small vessel, or even in just a boat. The rudder's quite small, but it controls everything, and that's the way the tongue is. So we all get it. Then he likened it to a forest fire. He says the tongue is a small part of the body, but it boasts great things. We're going to come back to this boasting later, but we know what boasting represents, or what's coming out of the heart is a lack of humility. It's arrogance. That's what produces boasting. I was told a long time ago by a professor I had that everybody's the hero of their own story. And that tends to be true. It's just how we're geared. And as Christians, we have this new nature. And if we live on the basis of the new nature, our speech should be exactly the opposite of boasting. And you have to ask yourself, and James is going to get there in a moment, but what is speech going to look like if it's the opposite of boasting? What's the heart attitude that would generate it? Arrogance and ambition, envy, jealousy, those kinds of things produce a certain kind of speech, and humility produces another. And so he's going to get there. But what a vivid image of the damage our words can cause, because he says, a small fire, that just little spark, sets ablaze a large forest. And this, of course, is all a metaphor for words. And it could be something seemingly small. Often the speaker thinks it's inconsequential, and yet it sets ablaze. It causes this kind of destruction and damage. And the thing about the forest fires is the damage it leaves behind takes a long time to repair. And in reality, it also kills, right? It kills things in its path. And to the extent that the forest would grow back, it takes a long time. There was a forest fire out very close to my parents' home. It got within like 100 yards out in East Texas. And it's been like 15 years. And when you drive to their house, there's still areas that used to have big pine trees that have no trees, and you can see the piece of the tree that's left behind, the 8 or 10 feet that has no, it's just kind of still charred and sticking there. That's what forest fires do. And in given that, the Christian is supposed to have a special awareness when we choose to say things and how we choose to say it and when we choose to say it. As you know, we're to have a special awareness that our words can, in this sense, speak death when we ought to be people who speak life, peace, and love. So that's where James is going. I don't these verses. I've always said these verses are not hard, but they're hard sometimes. I think to actually think about and make a deliberate effort to control our speech. Better to be silent than to start these fires. So James pointed out, and we did see this verse last time, that humans are able to tame all kinds of animals, but they can't tame their tongue. Our tongue will never be completely under control, but the one who can consistently do so is mature. But everybody will mess up from time to time. It's just this thing that won't be tamed. It's a restless evil. Like it's just trying to find some way, it seems, to do evil. And the deadly poison speaks again uh, of its what's the word? I mean, it kills in that sense, and it can cause death, of course. And often though it's figurative here of destruction or damage in a person's life, but it can cause death. And if you've watched the news over the last several years, one of the things with the advent of social media is that it has been negatively impactful on young people, particularly teenagers. And I have read stories from time to time of young children being bullied through social media and taking their lives. Kids at 11 or 12, things that are just, um, I just don't remember hearing about that when I was at that age. I remember one person that had committed suicide when I was growing up, but it had nothing to do with social media, and it was at an older age. But we read those things, and it's anyway. We get it. Like if we're being realistic about it, that the tongue can cause great damage, and it really is full of deadly poison. If that's the case, we ought to be taking great care with about this issue. Like this ought to be an issue that we're thinking about as a Christian for ourselves. It's an issue that we should be hearing quite a lot about from the pulpit, and it includes speech is would include, of course, in a modern age where we tend not to be speaking face to face all the time, but through a computer or social media, whatever we might write, it matters. So. And I'll pause here in a moment. Everything I think I just said was stuff we kind of covered last week, but it grounds where we're at here. With the tongue, it can be completely unnatural to its design purpose. We realize that the fall happens in Genesis 3, and we have this sin nature of this flesh, and it seems to have a focal point at the tongue or the words that we will speak. And it's not natural. It's not the way it ought to be. And James makes comparison to some other things in nature, a spring, a spring or a well, and a fig tree, to make this simple point that there is something unnatural, something contrary to God's design intent, that we would use this same tongue to both bless God. We're at church, we're singing, praising the Lord, and with our next breath or 1 hour later or whatever, we curse people who are made in God's likeness. He says That's highly disturbing because it's so contrary to God's design intent. And if one of the things the scripture is about as we become Christians is getting back to what we were originally designed for. We were not designed to be sinners. That came later. We were not designed to curse people made in God's likeness. That came later. And so this unnaturalness is what James focuses on. Blessing and cursing come out of the same mouth. That doesn't make sense. It's contrary to the designed order of things. So he says, my brethren, these things shouldn't be this way. Does a spring pour out sweet and bitter water from the same opening? And the answer is no. Can a fig tree produce olives? The answer is no. Or a grapevine produce figs? The answer is no. And of course, all of that's because God has designed those things for purpose. And our tongue was not designed for the purpose of cursing people. It was for the purpose of speaking life, speaking righteousness, expressing love through our words. So neither can a saltwater spring yield fresh water. These things are all examples from nature, and our tongue isn't natural in that sense. It's the thing that is contrary to all these examples. It blesses and curses. So, given what James has said here, it's just hard to overstate the seriousness of the issue. And when you think back now on James chapter 2, verse 12, he said, so speak and act as those who will be judged by the perfect law of liberty. Jesus would say in Matthew 12 that in the King James, every idle word would be judged. This is a big deal. When we think of what is at issue at the Bema, we stand before Christ. I think you can show from the scripture words, thoughts, and actions, all three of those. And words, they're just bringing the thoughts to the surface, but words, thoughts, and actions. And so our words matter a great deal. The Pharisees focused on the outward conduct. They had not murdered somebody, but Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, but you had anger in your heart. They had not gone through the physical act of adultery, but Jesus said, but you've lusted after this other person that's not your wife. The thoughts matter as well as the actions. And then when we get to this matter of language, those thoughts that matters too, because the things in the heart typically come out. So he's contrasting God's design and what we're actually doing. And when our
Eat your
speech,
leftovers. Okay. So here's the problem. All right. The more he talks, the less.
sorry, the when speech is uncontrolled, it becomes a contradiction. So let's pause there. Thoughts so far, because we're going to get in next to it's going to look like he switches topics, but not really. He's going to talk about wisdom. Any other comments or thoughts about speech and especially about how do we personally go about dealing with this?
I was just going to say that this sounds similar to what Jesus said in Matthew about a tree and its fruits, about false prophets. This is similar language here.
Yeah, to Matthew 12. Yeah.
This is a little humor. Duct tape comes to mind.
Duct tape will fix anything, especially in Texas. When we crack our cars, we tape them back together. Um, but it is something in the Proverbs about, I mean, if you can't control it, at least try to just not talk, baby.
Yeah, I mean this thing seems to be the first. As soon as you slip into that carnal mindset, it seems like this is the one that manifests the quickest.
Hmm.
That you just shoot your mouth off, you know.
What do you think about the idea that someone runs their mouth, but then later says, that's not, you know, that's not really who I am. I'm sorry I said those things. It's not really who I am.
I think that's a clear indication what you might call hypocrisy. I think the person's guilty conscience is they're trying to salve their conscience because they
Mm-hmm.
know what they did was wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but they, for whatever reason, they can't control it.
What if they're drunk?
Yeah,
That's
hmm,
a total different level.
Yeah.
yeah, because the alcohol, you know, lowers it removes something of a barrier, right?
Yeah.
Because also you know you also have these instances where somebody is in the hospital and they're on some pain med or something and they just start saying stuff that they never would say, you know?
Mhm.
Hmm.
It just means that it was in the heart all the time and your filter has been removed.
That's what I think. I think the filter is removed and that it's there. Now, I let me caveat because I could come up with other illustrations, but when people get dementia, I think they often say things that they not only would they not have said before, I'm not even sure they thought it because things aren't quite straight, and those who have dealt with that maybe know it. But I don't buy the idea that because someone had a little too much booze, they said things that they didn't think. Those words came from somewhere. That's my thought. Dart, you're on mute. Are you there, Dart? It shows you muted. Okay. Um, well, just should think about it
Sorry
because,
about that.
oh yeah, go ahead.
I swear I unmuted myself, but I guess I missed it.
The cat did
Um,
it.
I'm reminded of Galatians 5:16, but I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. So, for me, in order to control my tongue, I need to be walking by the Spirit, which means that every day I have to say anything I say really should honor God. So after I say something, usually it's when I'm on the road and somebody passes me or something. I gotta say, did I just say that? Did that honor God or not? And it
Yeah.
actually goes back to your thoughts, because your thoughts have to honor God too.
Mhm. Yeah. And you make a really important point that we never want to lose sight of. This idea of controlling our speech isn't just having better discipline. The reality is there are some wicked people who do a pretty good job of controlling their speech when they believe people are watching. We have a word for that. It's called politician. But when they're on the proverbial hot mic and don't know it, the truth comes out. Or when they're in a situation where they feel like they're not being videoed, and so it's not about discipline. We need the ministry of the Spirit, the indwelling Spirit, where we're walking in the Spirit. And when you think about Romans 8, Paul connects as he's talking about this very matter of walking in the Spirit. He connects it to you what your mind is set on. The mind set on the things of the Spirit will experience, that person will experience life and peace. The mind that is set on the things of the flesh will likewise, sort of reap death. And so this matter of controlling our speech really does begin in our heads and where our mind is focused. We're going to have a mindset on the things of God, or not. And that's going to really impact, I think, what we do, what we say.
Yeah, like the Romans, I think the Romans had a saying, in vino veritas,
Hmm.
truth in the wine.
Ah,
Yeah.
well, it's just I mean I thought of, and I'm not going to say his name, but I was thinking of someone who, was kind of a famous actor who got recorded on a drunken tirade and said all kinds of bad stuff. Now, I'm not a fan of people being secretly recorded, okay? Because while we shouldn't say the bad stuff, sometimes things are said in private that are not done to necessarily to harm anybody else, and then they get, recorded and then harm happens or whatever. But I remember that person defending what they said is like that's not really what I believe or think. I was mad, I was drunk, and anger is one of those other ones that removes the filter. All right, uncontrolled anger. But I don't think it reveals things that aren't there. It reveals things that are there that people have generally tried to exercise some restraint over and not to verbalize those things. Just kind of how it is. But because this is a big thing, and when we think of maturity, James has said that your speech is a hallmark of maturity. It's my way of summarizing what he said. What else is a hallmark of spiritual maturity? Like, what are some things you would associate with a person that's mature? Because I think folks sometimes have the idea that maturity is because they've been a Christian a long time and they've lost some of their hair. It's not quite that simple, maybe. What else would we want to find in the life of someone who's mature?
Wisdom.
Yeah, he's fixing to get there. We'd expect to find some wisdom. Do you get wise just because you get old?
In some respects, maybe, but not with respect to Christian maturity, no.
I mean, it's not an automatic. Some people just go their whole life making the same stupid mistakes over and over. But what else? So wisdom, we would expect some what we would call biblical or godly wisdom in their lives, practical living. What else? Control the speech, practical
Humi
wisdom.
humility.
We'd expect humility, and that's sort of goes along with the fruit of the Spirit. Although I will say you don't have to have spiritual maturity to reflect this fruit of the Spirit, so I want to be careful with that. But you would expect a mature person to more consistently reflect the fruit of the Spirit, and that would include humility and in a long list of other things. What else might we expect? Um, how would a mature person deal with criticism? Go ahead, Judd.
I was just
Oh
thinking
yeah,
of going according to the Holy Spirit and according to what you've learned instead of just jumping in.
yeah, yeah. You know, the in I read lots of apologetic books because um I tend to enjoy them, but I also have this really long commute to work. That allows me to read about 70 books a year. When I say read, I actually mean I'm listening to it, so you understand. And so one of the things I've done for the last couple of years is I've read just about all the, the apologetics books that, written in the last, 10 years, that are at least, somewhat well known. And what I've found in that is that very few of them get beyond just a handful of basic topics. Very few of those apologetics books get to the bigger issue of having a broad Christian worldview. In other words, we can deal with, apologetics from the standpoint of how we answer some objections about this or that. But really the Christian worldview that needs to be defended through apologetics is broad based and it touches on everything. And maturity I think will be seen in how people have developed this broader worldview. In other words, not just that they have some understanding of justification by faith alone, which they should have, but how do you approach all the issues of life, things about political theory and the arts and just all kinds of things from a truly biblical perspective? Or is it the case that Christians wouldn't look at those things any differently than anybody else? I think the Bible has that in mind. So for what it's worth, and so it's kind of a broad like how we think will be grounded in Scripture and not just discrete teachings like don't steal, but the broader principles that God has about how we should think about the world around us, for what it's worth. Um, I know somebody else had a hand up. Anybody else before we get it? Yes, Judd? Or is it Winnie? But you're on mute though. So it still shows you on
I'm
mute.
sorry. I'm sorry.
That's
We
okay.
just went to a funeral on Monday of someone that just had died. The spouse died, and four men, it was their mother. I guess they were around 40. And it was so Christ-like to me because of the unbelievable lack of selfishness. The whole thing was Christ-centered, biblical,
Mm,
hopeful. Um, every single one of them, they lost their beloved. I don't know that I could be anything like they were. They were amazing. And I thought that lack of selfishness and that selflessness was so Christ-like,
mhm.
so mature. It was absolutely incredible and amazing, amazing.
Yeah, and that's a great example. And we're James is fixing to call out that very thing. That selflessness is uniquely a quality that Christians, of course, should exhibit on a consistent basis. And I think a mature Christian will do so. And all these things, a Christian, even a new Christian, can do these things because we can walk in the Spirit. But we should see that. And I have had similar experiences at a handful of funerals where I actually left, what's the word, encouraged. There's a grief associated with the loss of this person, but what they've left behind in the way that they're surrounded by people who have, they're believers and have a very, mature Christian worldview about things, and it's expressed when they've eulogized whoever's passed and talked about their lives. That's a big thing. It's a hallmark of maturity. I think, one could generate a list of a lot of things. Often when we think about the list of things that would just characterize mature people, as I say, speech gets left out, but there's a number of other pieces, and they all kind of go together. Cheryl?
I think it has a lot to do with having less of yourself in the middle of that.
Hmm.
Um, the big thing today is, being people being offended. Well,
Hmm.
the thing is then the focus is on you, and instead of what is going on around you or the person that you're observing or you're speaking with, it's where is your focus?
Hmm.
And I just know I get this feeling in my gut when someone says, "Well, I'm just so offended."
Well,
Yeah.
there's a certain fakeness to that idea of being offended because we've adopted a mentality in our popular culture that when somebody doesn't like an idea that you're sharing, they can say they're offended. And it's rarely the case that in any literal sense they've been offended. They just think you should not be allowed to speak. And one of the things about a mature Christian is they can have discussions with people that don't agree with them without getting angry. Think about that. Popular wisdom says don't talk about, religion and politics. But the reason that's said is because we just recognize that most people don't have the maturity to handle it, Christian or otherwise. They can't handle it. They can't handle the remote possibility that somebody might not only suggest they're wrong, but have some good facts to back up their point of view. But Christians should be able, in general, to have that kind of conversation and not allow anger to take control and words to come out that they may wish they had not said later.
I think that's where gentleness comes in.
Mm, gentleness. And it's interesting, that's a good word because you're fixing to see that in James here in a second. Gentleness. So let's look at wisdom. Back in chapter one, when he opened the book talking about the different trials of life and how God uses trials to grow us, it's when we have our growth spurts to maturity, right? Maturity was introduced there. So maturity has been at the back of James's mind throughout this book. And when he talks about controlling the tongue, he's really getting at an aspect of maturity. But he also said back in reference to the trials of life, we should pray to God for wisdom, which is a little different than just having God's word. Parts of God's word are in the form of wisdom, but wisdom is more than knowing what's right and wrong. It's also the judgment as to what to do with that knowledge. I just used a dictionary definition because I just think wisdom um, it's we know what it means, although a lot of folks have the idea of it just being wise old sayings or something like that. You know, the things you open up the cookie at the Chinese restaurant and you pull a little piece of paper out and it's got some little bit of wisdom on there. But it's more than that. It assumes some knowledge of what's true or right, and I think this pretty well matches with the Bible idea. Like we got to know what God thinks about things, but there's also judgment about what to do with it. And so in chapter one, he said to pray. But when you get to chapter three, James says, listen, there's two kinds of wisdom here. And the one you live by will guide how you live. It will guide the way your life looks. It'll guide your language, your words, your thoughts, your actions, all that stuff. And so he brings in this two kinds of wisdom. And sometimes folks think he's left behind speech, but speech is at the heart of this thing. Wise people can control their speech. And I last lesson had put up a number of proverbs about this matter of speech. The book of Proverbs says a great deal about speech. Really, throughout the Bible, we find a great deal about speech. But so we're introduced to these two kinds of wisdom. James asks the question, and he's not switched topics. He just told us how deadly the tongue can be, and then says, "Who among you is wise and understanding?" Similar language that you would find in the book of Proverbs. It talks about people having wisdom or knowledge or understanding. He says, by his good conduct, the person who would claim to be wise and have understanding, by his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in the gentleness. There's the word that was just mentioned. I think Carol said it a moment ago. Here it is, gentleness that comes from wisdom. Now, I will tell you, and I went ahead and put definitions of conduct on this slide. I'll do gentleness on the next. Some translations, like the King James and maybe the New King James, for gentleness will have the word meekness or humility, and that's probably a good translation. This word often has that meaning, but it can have little glosses, and we're not going to get all hung up on that. But it makes sense that he has the idea in mind of humility or meekness, because in a moment he's going to talk about the opposite, which would be arrogance. We'll see that in a moment. But by his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in the gentleness that comes from wisdom. So, wisdom, like when especially if you think of Proverbs, but that's certainly not the only place that has it. But Proverbs kind of comes to mind. It serves as a good example. It's for practical living. It's nuts and bolts. The wisdom that Solomon shares there is designed to produce a certain life path that is guided. And so here, our conduct should show whether in fact we are wise and understanding. There's an old saying, the proof's in the pudding, right? And our conduct is sort of the proof in the pudding. Now, this word for conduct is it gets translated like conduct or behavior sometimes, but it's also like way of life. It's conduct expressed according to certain principles. It has the idea that you're following principles, and that makes sense here because it should be in accordance with that wisdom that you claim to have. And hopefully it's godly wisdom, and this conduct or behavior will be in accordance with this godly wisdom. Your conduct should show that your works are done in this gentleness. This can also be, um, like I said, humility that comes from the wisdom. And now he's going to give us a couple of examples of this, but not examples. He's going to talk about the sources of wisdom. I wanted to add this. I said it before. Gentleness is a noun, prautes, and you really do see it in some places. It's just straight up translated humility, but it has glosses here. And I'm not going to wring our hands a lot about it, but I wanted to mention them: gentleness, humility, courtesy, considerateness. I think in a moment when he's going to talk about the wrong kind of wisdom and how it produces arrogance, it suggests to me that he really has humility, that kind of gentleness in mind. And if you have humility, you'll have this kind of gentleness. I think that's probably what's there. A life guided by God's wisdom versus a life guided by the other kind of wisdom. Now, he hasn't introduced it yet, but he's fixing to. There's, broadly speaking, wisdom from God and wisdom from the world, and he has harsh words for wisdom from the world. Our speech will reflect the wisdom we follow. He talks about our conduct, but he's already said that if you can control your tongue, you can control everything else. And so now he's bringing in the um, piece of the puzzle that we need, which is wisdom. Wisdom has a great deal. This idea not only of knowing right from wrong, but good judgment about how to live and employ God's principles. He brings that into the picture because that's going to lead to our good conduct or not, including our speech. So let's look at the bad wisdom, and then I'll pause and we want to think about this. Bear in mind that there's a lot of kinds of wisdom, and they're not that aren't heavenly, but they're not always bad in the sense that it's just, for example, the wisdom one develops in a certain trade. They're an automobile mechanic. They've worked on cars for 30 years, and they have a certain wisdom about working on cars. It's not anything to do with right or wrong. It's simply that they kind of know how it works. In my own trade of being an attorney, I just know things I didn't know when I started 30 years ago, and that's how it happens. You pick up a certain wisdom to like your trade. But here we're talking about the wisdom that guides our life path in general. And he starts with the negative example, and it's really largely the way our world thinks. You need to live for you, look out for you, that kind of thing. We've developed life coaches. That's a thing. What do life coaches do? They give you worldly wisdom so you can be more worldly. He says if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, it starts in the heart, it comes out in the mouth and the conduct. But look what he says, don't boast. If you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast and deny the truth. What's in there in the heart comes out in the speech is the idea. And he's going to contrast that with heavenly wisdom in a moment, which will do the opposite. But notice these words, bitter envy. Bitter envy is two different words in English and in Greek. We kind of have the idea of bitter, but envy. Now, envy is a little different than jealousy. Jealousy is me fearing someone else taking something I already have. Okay, so we talk about or harming something I have. The Bible says in places that God is jealous. There can be a righteous kind of jealousy where he's protective of his own. But when we think of it in the sinful way of jealousy, we're in fear of others taking what we have. Envy, though, is that I want what others have, or I have a negative attitude that they've had some success. I read an article just this weekend in the news about two actors, an actor and actress, you would know who they were, but this actress uh, had they were a couple, and she had taken a certain role that he said he didn't want her to take, and she ended up winning an Academy Award for it, and he wouldn't even attend the ceremony. Now, I'm not into all the Hollywood thing, but it kind of shows that sort of attitude when you you're mad when someone else succeeds. I mean, that's what envy does. If someone else has an achievement or whatever, they've gotten the promotion, they were able to buy a new fancy car, why can't we be happy with how God has blessed them or what their hard work has earned? But instead, a lot of folks, they don't. They have this bitter envy, this attitude towards, other people's achievements. And that happens in churches. That happens among people in the pastorate. One guy envies another because the other guy maybe the church has grown bigger or he got on TV. I mean, this can affect anybody, and it's a bad thing. And then, of course, selfish ambition. Paul would talk about that phrase, selfish ambition, in other places. He talks about people preaching the gospel out of selfish ambition. Some people are motivated that way. And so, all of this in verse 15 is tied to a wisdom that he says isn't from God. Susan?
I just want to comment on what you said about, uh, people are doing themselves. You have that a lot in Asian cultures.
Hmm.
Uh, Growing up, my parents, maybe not in a negative way, but maybe, I don't know, they always compare, not really compare, but if you could not get an A in a class, they will say, well, they got an A, why can't you not get an A? So it
Hmm.
kind of um, brought some type of, I'm smarter than you, I can do more than you. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
you have that a lot in Asian cultures where parents will do that. Maybe to not have their kids set back, not being lazy, but just go ahead and do whatever you can. But I think it, and as they get older, that might show in when they go and get a job, always wanted to be on top of everybody, always having the best job, the higher rank, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I personally experienced that. And today I see how it affects my siblings. Some
Hmm.
of them cannot deal with it, because of, maybe my parents want us to do better, but it came across differently. So
Yeah. Yeah. It's a real thing, and the world doesn't think of that as wrong, is the thing, and yet it can be harmful, and it can build in us this idea that even if it was just intended to motivate you to do better, and we all would want our kids to make good grades and stuff, but you could get that perspective of envy of those who have gotten some achievement that maybe you don't have yet, a promotion, like you say, in the workplace. And I've seen it, and probably if you've been around a while and been in different workplaces, you've seen the person that, if they can't be the one that gets ahead, they want to make sure no one else does, that kind of thing. And this kind of thing is just true to life. It's true to life for Christians, and James is telling them that's not what you should be about. We was talking about hallmarks of maturity. One of them is being able to take some joy or to rejoice in other people's accomplishments. Some people can't do that, you know, um, and it's kind of scary. So this wisdom, James says, the wisdom, the source of the wisdom is demonstrated by what it produces in our life. And if it produces selfish ambition, if it produces envy, if it produces boasting and outright denying the truth, that wisdom doesn't come from above. It's not from God. It's earthly, it's unspiritual. He even uses this word demonic. That's a pretty strong term. But think about that, because this creates a situation. Can Christians live according to demonic wisdom? And the answer is yes, and they probably won't realize they are. But as I say, and as James is saying, the proof sort of in the pudding. It comes out in their lives. This has not anything to do with whether they're really a Christian. James is speaking to Christians, and he's warning them that you can be living a sort of worldly, unspiritual, demonic wisdom that's not from God. And it's going to impact everything, including how you speak. So he says, where there is envy and selfish ambition, there's disorder. And look at that last phrase, every evil practice. This word boasting that he mentions, it's one of the long Greek words, and I'm not going to pronounce it, but I have a bullet at the bottom. But it usually has the idea of boasting at the expense of another, right? It's not just so much, look how awesome I am. I'm better than you. It's boasting at the expense of another, boasting against, exulting over other people. It becomes this haughty attitude toward others, and so we all should recognize like that's not what we should be about as Christians, but it can happen, and it's sourced in a wisdom that's demonic, and we should be shocked by the idea that we might be living according to a worldly demonic wisdom. But it can happen, and we may not even be aware of it. But we should know, we should have some idea. And if nothing else, maybe we've had some people around us tell us, they may not use the phrase selfish ambition, but they see it and they can kind of characterize what's there. Wherever those things are, though, there's disorder and every evil practice. Um, this matter of every evil practice is interesting. The world has the idea, I think, that sin is, I mean, we don't use sin in the normal conversation, but the idea is that somebody could have one failing where, let's say, they sin, and they do it all the time, maybe it's their thing, but it doesn't impact the rest of their life, right? Otherwise, they're pretty much a saint. I don't think that's consistent with the Bible. That is, when you engage in a particular sin and it becomes something you continue in, I don't think it ever travels alone. It's just something you can think about. Maybe you've got a thought or comment on it. My observation is, and I think James is getting at it here, if the sin you're doing, it has to be rooted in a heart condition. For example, selfish ambition. The symptom of that is a particular action you might take or a word you might speak, but the ambition's still there. It's not that you would have this one failing, but everything else you're just sort of sainted. I think it brings about multiple evil practices, and they go together. Any thoughts on that? I'm not articulating it well, but I hope you're understanding what I'm suggesting. And everybody raised their hand at the same time. That's okay. Um, when you watch the news, we have a social vision in this country that's telling us all kinds of things that we're supposed to believe. But when you read what people do, all these things that are being celebrated are always parallel or paired up with all kinds of other sin at the same time. They never travel alone. What's in our heart will come out in that speech, and by reversing that around, our speech can reveal a lot of evil that's there under the hood. Why would a Christian choose to live this way? Envy plus selfish ambition leads to all this evil. So our speech may reveal deep spiritual problems that we shouldn't minimize. Now look at the reverse of this, and we'll close out. This is, I think, this is the end of the chapter. One note, he ends talking about peace, which is not a surprise. Jesus said we should be peacemakers. The very next verse in chapter 4, verse 1, talks about Christians being at war with other people. So it becomes these two verses are kind of a hinge. Like chapter 3, verse 1 kind of got us from be quick to listen to be slow to talk. And then these verses are moving us from slow to talk to slow to be angry. And so he brings us up to being peacemakers. I hope you'll see this. The book's very organized. And in chapter 4, verse 1, he'll talk about this, going to war with people. But in any event, there's wisdom from below, and we need to recognize it, and we need as Christians to not accept worldly wisdom. And it really comes back to you need to know scriptures, you need to know God's wisdom, a lot of which, I mean, in some sense, all of the Bible is giving us wisdom, but stuff like Proverbs, I mean, we need to know this stuff. We need God's wisdom. It's going to come out in our lives. If we're not living on God's wisdom, we will be living on a worldly wisdom that's going to also come out in our lives. And so we should never want to do that. The proof is in the pudding. The wisdom from above, the godly wisdom, is pure. That it usually has the idea of being like morally pure. And then it's peace loving or peaceable, which will set the stage, as I said, for the next chapter. It's gentle. This is not the same word that was used for gentle earlier, that often, that prautes, that usually means humility. But gentle, compliant, or reasonable. You'll see some different words in different translations, but you recognize what he's spelling out here. It's it's the opposite of the boasting, the selfish ambition, the envy. It's the opposite. Because those people with that attitude are always in competition with somebody. They're always at war with somebody in that sense. This is peace loving, gentle, compliant, full of mercy. None of these words, by the way, mean weak. Um, in another context, like the Apostle Paul writing, I suspect he would liken these things to being part of the fruit of the Spirit, because that's how this is going to happen. But full of mercy. Remember, that's the standard in James 2:12 at the Bema judgment. Mercy, good fruits, unwavering, and without pretense. I love that one at the end, without pretense. That's we all understand this idea that sometimes people do good things, but there's a pretense for it. They're manipulating us for something they want, that sort of thing. There's no pretense here. This is just genuine, unselfish, unambitious in that evil sense of ambition. That looks to use other people's opportunities. It's the opposite of all of that, and it's full of mercy. And then he adds, "The fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who makes peace." Well, this wisdom produces inward changes, which is important, and those inward changes are the very kind of things that will matter at the Bema. And as I said, the gentle word here at the bottom bullet is different than gentleness we saw before. And I found the definition interesting, and it's why you'll see different translations on that. Not insisting on every right of letter or law or custom. This made me think and I know it was because of my business. There's just people who they can't let a wrong go by. Like they've got to deal. Take it to the highest court in the land, like every little thing. And everything has to be a certain way for them. Every I dotted, every T crossed, and maybe in a perfect world that would happen, but we're not in a perfect world anymore. It's fallen, and we got to deal with people, and this gentleness, which I think could entail a little bit of tolerance, not in our new worldly sense, which just means approve whatever people do. But there can be some tolerance, recognizing that other people got some problems just like you, and you'd like them to show a little grace towards you sometimes too. It's a lot bound up in this word. But this matter in the last verse, and then we'll stop, is the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace. How do you actually sow seeds of peace? Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers; they shall be called the children of God." Matthew 5, right? The Beatitudes. How do we sow seeds of peace? Well, we do so in what we say and do. Our actions will sow peace or not. And that's, of course, what's examined at the Bema. Those who control their speech are able to control the entire person, and so they're able to sow seeds of peace. And the idea is, as Christians, that is what we should be doing, sowing seeds of peace, cultivating peace, And that generates the fruit of righteousness. So we have a wisdom that is of the world and it's designed around your selfish ambitions, getting what you want. Other people are to be manipulated in order to advance your agenda. And most of the world lives on that, and they think that's perfectly right. The world's not going to meet you halfway. You only have one candle to burn. You know, you need to put you in the middle. You need to do you. You need to do what's best for you, and all that kind of emphasis. And then we have this wisdom from above that's of a total different character. It's something in our heart that's different that comes out in what we do. And we really, James is recalling something he probably heard Jesus say in his presence. Be a peacemaker. Sow peace. And our speech is connected to that. It's at the center of that. We're going to sow peace with our words often. Uh, well, any closing thoughts or comments before we wrap up for today? Okay. Well, good enough. Let's convene next time in chapter 4. We're getting, we'll get through 4 and 5 pretty quickly. We're getting that last section of the book about being slow to anger, which makes sense. None of you have ever been around Christians that fight with one another, but apparently it has happened somewhere because James wrote about it. Cheryl?
I think this is a really tough part of the book, a really tough topic, because everything that you've talked about today is pointing the arrow right at ourselves. And I think
Mhm.
maybe that's why people don't have much to say, because a lot to think about, and and how many times do we actually see ourselves in these situations and think, oh my God, I really didn't handle that well. So I think this is not an easy part of the book. It really isn't.
But it is easy to understand though. And
Yes.
that's the thing, right? Sometimes we make this harder. I mean, we deal with challenging verses like James 2, not I mean but they have practical meaning. But most of the scripture really isn't that hard to understand. We just struggle to do it. And I appreciate Sherry, you're being just open and honest about it, but we all do it. I totally do it. I do think some wisdom has been shared, and Dart had made the comment about, asking that question to yourself, is this honoring God? I had suggested, and because it's something I realized a long time ago, I'm struggling with this James 3 thing. I'm struggling with this speech, and I really try to ask myself, are these gracious words that I'm going to say in a gracious way? Are they uh, are they going to edify? Now, there are times, and I think they're uncommon, but times when we have to use harsh words because of the circumstances. I'm not eliminating that. I'm not saying that there's never a time that those are appropriate. I, this is something we struggle with, and but to have the awareness, to be reminded of James 3, and to have that awareness and have it on our mind, and to let it come to mind when we've already let the words out of our mouth, but then we hear, we're sort of what we're doing is we're hearing the Holy Spirit in the background saying, "Is that really what you wanted to say?" Right? Now we just I think going through like James 3, just remind ourselves, deal with it then, and then try to do better with it. Well, James is a great study. Um, I think it got mentioned, it may have been before the recording started, that Dan and I had the same pastor for years. He's retired now, but he did a series through James, and he called it God's Practical Hammer. And it's because of things like James 3. It is a practical hammer that's sort of, building us into shape, I hope. Well, next week, though, we'll get on the part about anger and that kind of thing, because some Christians somewhere actually get angry at other Christians. And we'll talk about that. And with that said, I hope you have a good rest of your weekend, and we'll see you in a week.
All right, Hudson.
All right.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Enjoy. Have a safe trip.
Oh, thank you. Bye-bye.